So welcome again, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. We will now start. So I will give the floor to Mrs. Kathleen Dominique, Senior Policy Analyst and Financing Water Lead at the OECD. So please, Kathleen, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Diane, and so good to be here with you, and many thanks for the organizers for the invitation to contribute to this important workshop. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today, and I'd like to start by welcoming all the participants to this session 3 of the workshop on day 2, which will focus on financing transboundary water management and basin development, in particular looking at the role of private financial actors and looking at how private finance may be able to be leveraged for transboundary investments. Now, let me start with a very quick recap of what was discussed yesterday, just to set the scene and also give a bit of a preview about what's planned for today. Yesterday's discussion provided an overview of financing needs for transboundary water cooperation and basin development. This was an opportunity to hear from several countries and river basin organizations on how they use financial resources from domestic budgets, from climate finance and other public sources to secure funding for cooperation, for shared institutions, and to ensure the sustainable development of the basin. Today's discussion is we'll continue to explore some of these avenues, but looking very much at the private financial dimension, and also innovative financing mechanisms that can help and contribute to these transboundary goals. We will hear from specific country and multilateral development banks to better understand how they work together in a complementary way to raise the necessary funding for transboundary water cooperation and basin development. Thus, what we'll be really focusing on in this session is the role of private finance the role private finance can play here, and how it can be leveraged by other sources of funding and finance. Before we get started with our presentations, we have a very interesting panel of presenters and a responding expert. I just want to highlight a couple of the discussion questions, actually, which you can see here on the slide. Let me just quickly touch on them that can help our presenters and also the discussant focus in on the key elements that we want to draw out here. Typically, we are interested in looking at which private funding sources are available for transboundary cooperation, what types of activities or measures within that cooperation are the most appropriate for looking at mobilizing private funding. Another question is really from a private financial actor perspective, what are they looking for when they're investing in shared river basins? What kind of risk return profile is interesting for them? Also, how can private finance be mobilized, if at all, by repairing countries and joint bodies? So what are opportunities to crowd in private finance using leverage of public funds and de-risking instruments, for example? And of course, there's an important trend around ESG investment, so environmental, social, and corporate governance investment, and how can this type of analysis further integrate some of those dimensions related to transboundary cooperation in order to try to attract investors who are interested in these types of sustainable investment opportunities. So those are some of the overarching questions we want to explore here, and indeed, as I mentioned, we have 4 very interesting presenters and a responding expert. Each presenter will have 10 minutes, and our expert will have 5 minutes then at the end to respond before we move to Q&A. I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and indeed, because we will have time for Q&A, I would encourage you to please post questions in the chat as we go. We'll be monitoring that and selecting some questions for our speakers. Now, let's get started with our first speaker. I'd like to introduce Ms. Karen Krachnek, the program manager from the 2030 Water Resources Group of the World Bank. She'll give a presentation on private financial actors and water investments in shared basins. What are private investors looking for when investing in water-related projects, and what financial mechanisms are being used? Thanks very much, Karen, for being here. You've got 10 minutes. I turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me here today. If you could go to the next slide, please. So in terms of water is repeatedly on the top of the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report. And this is what spurred the creation of 2030 Water Resources Group, which is what I manage, where companies like Nestle and Coca-Cola gathered with other leaders in Davos over 10 years ago to decide that a public, private sector, civil society platform is what's needed to break down silos and create the trust among institutions to help advance water security. No one institution can solve water problems, and that is obviously true when it comes to transboundary systems. Next slide, please. When we speak about the private sector, I do want us to think about very broadly in terms of the different types of private sector. So there are water users, that can be large industrial units, manufacturing companies, also financial institutions. There's supply chain actors such as agribusiness companies, textile companies. There's, of course, technology companies, and then service providers. So I just want us to think very broadly when we think about private sector. As we've developed 2030 Water Resources Group and our multi-stakeholder platforms, we've made sure that all the stakeholders equally involved, and each one has an important role to play. And as you can see here, there are different roles the private sector has to play in terms of improving their water efficiency, reducing their water footprint, advancing water stewardship, treating water quality, and so forth. The one that obviously doesn't appear on this list is financing. And certainly the private sector can bring in financing, and that's the topic of the session today. It stems from the sentiment that private sector not be seen as an ATM machine. And so when the SDGs were being adopted, it was the first time that I was in New York when they were being adopted, and I heard government after government reference the important role of the private sector. But we have to admit that the private sector is still sorting out how best to engage when it comes to water. When it comes to water, we know that businesses have physical, reputational, and regulatory risks to their direct operations or to the supply chains. But I'll be honest, even with all of these risks, we have to admit that water is not always the highest priority. I've been in many conversations where private sector company representatives said they struggle to get their chairmen of their board and all their board overall to prioritize water. But more and more companies are prioritizing water, and that is really a good trend in setting targets for water. Some of the most recent ones are Microsoft and Cargill. Next slide, please. So private sector engagement in water is evolving. I think that's one key message here. It is evolving, and I think one to consider in transboundary systems how to build that evolution into this. We have to admit that the water sector overall has not been the most innovative when you compare it maybe to energy and transport. Water is a local issue. It's a complex one of quantity and quality issues, especially in transboundary systems, obviously. So it's often really hard to put together the right incentives and the structures for private sector investments. The background paper that everyone read was very clear on these challenges of bringing in the private sector, and I completely agree on these. For those companies that do prioritize water, most of them really obviously look inside their own four walls, as I said, in terms of improving efficiency of their operations. And they're struggling to see how to engage in basins and watersheds. But I do want to say they're evolving in that space of how to engage in basins and watersheds. Obviously, I've heard private sector companies say, I can be a clean fish in a dirty pond. And so it's very much in terms of, how to engage with other different actors. The challenge is that companies have to show returns on investments. We have to be honest about that. And so for basin-wide or watershed activities, they're difficult to justify their local operations. So they have to justify for their local operations and their organizational structures. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, public-private partnerships are evolving. I know you will hear more about public-private partnerships later in the session. I do want to share, so for 2030 Water Resources Group and the IFC of the World Bank, we recently, with the government of Bangladesh and their Public-Private Partnership Authority, we structured and implemented the first of its kind PPP, a sustainable PPP model to develop wastewater treatment facilities in Bangladesh. The idea is then to replicate this model across all of the potential 100 economic zones of the country. And what I want to offer today is this model could perhaps also be used in transboundary basins. Obviously, economic zone development cuts across transboundary basins. And it could be something when it comes to looking at the engagement of the private sector, looking at it from economic zone perspective, right? And using that when it comes to transboundary context to bring in the private sector in creative and innovative ways. But we have to admit also PPPs require government leadership to embrace these models and to put in place the legal and regulatory mechanisms to support PPP development. So I will share, for example, in Mexico, we're working through our multi-stakeholder platform to develop a first of its kind PPP in agri-water, in agriculture and water. And this has actually included also a dialogue with the water agency Conagua in Mexico on developing a PPP office within the water agency. So I think it's something to think about in the transboundary context is how do you level the playing field when it comes to private sector participation across multiple countries with different laws and different legal systems. Companies do work in a pre-competitive space, even though the natural tendency is competitive, but there is the pre-competitive space. And this offers, I think, something to think about, particularly perhaps in future background papers to cover also some of the legal environment questions, as well as some of the other enabling environment conditions that are needed for private sector investments, which I think were handled very well in the paper. Next slide, please. So when it comes to commercial finance, we can agree that it can be used to support all water-related infrastructure. And this is something that came across in the paper is that, commercial finance is available there. The challenge, again, when it comes to transboundary basins is finding the mechanisms that allow for acceptance of risks across all of the political and legal jurisdictions. So while the paper emphasized investments from private sector in infrastructure, and you see that here, I do want to encourage us to think more broadly beyond even infrastructure when it comes to private sector engagement. Next slide, please. So the opportunities there are at different scales, and you'll hear more about it probably from the other presenters. But I do want to say a few examples. So one in Kenya and Tanzania, 2030 Water Resources Group, we are developing what we term irrigation financing facilities. So it's a model that brings in private sector and relies on very stable and structured off-taker contracts. These are national level financial institutions. And I think what to think about is maybe, is there a way to bridge national level financial institutions to support transboundary investments, in essence, as broadening their portfolios across in these contexts. So something to think about is how to bring perhaps across agricultural corridors in transboundary basins, these types of innovative financing facilities. The second innovation we were involved in is in the Ganga Basin, which is, a very large basin, cuts across political boundaries within India as well. We, with the World Bank and IFC, developed the first of its kind hybrid annuity model for wastewater treatment plants. This included a cost-benefit risk analysis on centralized versus decentralized solutions, as well as coverage of the existing versus new assets. So this was really some of the analysis, I think, when coming into the transboundary context with private sector, is to think about these key questions, how to also shift the mindset of key government decision makers towards PPP and alternative finance solutions. So I think that's something for river basin organizations and governments engaged in the river basin organizations, is to think also how to advance these models from a legal and regulatory context within countries. Alternative financing and investments are looking at different key issues. If you, next slide, please. And this is my last slide. I think I'm running close to the end of time. So one thing came up in the paper is also around alternative financing and how investors are looking at these issues. So we can admit that, there's inadequate financing available from governments. So subsidy-driven models have challenges. There is an increasing focus from governments on water conservation and scaling innovations and circular economy approaches. So I think this is something to think about in the transboundary context from private sector investments with governments, is in water conservation, in this mix of green and gray infrastructure solutions, as well as in circular economy approaches. Also, we've seen obviously increasing urban flooding and recurrence of drought. And so the focus on resilience planning, I think, is something to consider when bringing in private sector in transboundary basin context. Again, with private sector, the evolution in terms of climate priorities is evolving. And I think that can be combined also with the attention on water as well. And I didn't have time to go into all of the different models, but there are newer financing models. There's social impact funds. There's many different types of structures being created. But the one thing I want to emphasize from this slide is really the element of trust. If you see, the key point, I think, is here on trust. For private sector, it's really important to build the dynamics of public-private trust. To focus on water not just as a sector, but as a connector. Again, for private sector companies, prioritizing water may be a challenge, but using water as a connector across all of the priorities of a corporate structure I think, will help in transboundary basins as we look at how to invest. So I think where river basin organizations and governments can focus is really on building the investment climate for transboundary investments. And so I hope, I've shared a few ideas, again, looking very innovative, agricultural corridors, economic zones, different ways to bring in these structures, but also taking into account the legal and regulatory mechanisms that will promote that investment climate. So I look forward to the discussion today, and thank you very much for having me.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karen. That was a very, very rich presentation indeed, helping us to understand some of these opportunities for PPP models and where private finance can be mobilized across the value chain, and also touching on some of these innovative financing mechanisms that we're gaining experience with. Very, very interesting. And of course, highlighting those important considerations for the transboundary context, where there's a real need for some serious thinking about creating the enabling environment that can help those models emerge, but also very much getting back to your point on building trust across the partners, and also finding ways to deal with risk sharing across these jurisdictions, whether they're across country borders or within countries, as you highlight. So that's extremely excellent way to start our conversation. I'd like to move to our next presenter now. This is Mr. Zepatsouth Fosufa. I hope I pronounced that okay. He is a partner at SNA Law, a former government representative from Laos, and he's going to present on how to leverage private financial resources for transboundary water infrastructure through PPP, and share that experience from Laos, in particular on the hydro power project there. So I'd like to welcome you and turn the floor straight over to you. You got 10 minutes, so we're looking forward to hearing from you. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for giving me time to share experience in developing a specific project that is Nam Turn 2 hydropower projects. In particular, a question raised how to leverage the private finance resources for transboundary water infrastructure through the public-private partnership. Next slide, please. And the picture on the front page, I took 30 years ago. And later on, I will present you what's look like now. And this is the project I'm going to present. And today, we have one hydropower project named Nam Turn 2 hydropower project. And the projects share many aspects between Laos and Thailand. As you can see on the screen, that the project is located up on the plateau, and once the water develop, the projects develop, and it transmitted electricity to Thailand, and the installed capacity of the electricity is 1,088 megawatts, and of which 1,000 megawatts for Thailand and 80 megawatts for Laos next. And I would like to present how the PP project come to develop today. And the project started perhaps about 100 years ago. In 1927, the project was invented by the French Indochina. And the project was supposed to develop for the industrial facilities, and the project did not go for some reason. And the project was not developed until 1980s, when the government was trying to develop project as an infrastructure project to provide electricity to the community vicinity. Again, the project failed for some reason. And next, until 1994, and the government of Laos signed the memorandum of understanding with an Australia-based company, and to develop project as a commercial project. And again, the project for some reason, and the project stalled. And until 1997, Electricité de France came on board and replaced the Australian company and developed the project. And also the World Bank was invited to participate in the development, and the other international financial institutions such as the Asian Development Bank, and also Agence Française de Développement in there, European Investment Bank also participated in the project. And the project was developed on a BOT basis. That means that the private investor and have 30% of equity in that project, and the rest 70% was private financing and was raised from the international banking system. So the project was developed on the condition imposed, for instance, for the host country. And the project, Nam Turn 2, had to be embedded in the National Poverty Eradication Program. And also, and the project, if it's developed, it must be taking care of environmental and social safeguard, in particular, and the environmental and social aspect in project vicinity, also in the downstream area. And so, and the third condition is that the community in particular, and in the riparian country need to provide support to the project. That is the conditions for the host country, or the host Laos country. And the other conditions that private investors need, that in particular the host country Laos needed to enforce investment friendly legislation. For instance, the Lao government undertook that it will address, for instance, sovereign events, change in law, and frustration or force majeure events. If such events occur and adversely impact the economic position of the project, the government need to undertake to take a remedial action. And also the government accept that if dispute arising out of during the project development, the Lao government need to take the dispute into the no-to dispute resolution elsewhere, not inside the country. And at the end, the government, need to make sure that the private investor have the financial criteria. For instance, the private investor need to have at least 15% of return equity, and also for the private banking system, in particular commercial lender, they need to ensure that the financial criteria, for instance, the debt service cover ratio, that is not less than 1.3%, and those conditions as required by the private participant. And the other conditions for the home country and for Thailand, where the electricity won't be dispatched. The Nam Turn 2 need to generate electricity at the cost achievable by the consumer in Thailand, and to be precisely that the electricity cost should not be higher than the cost they're supposed to generate for themselves. And so in having made these conditions, and the study of the project took for some years, as you can see that from 1997 until 2005, and before the financial close has been achieved. And soon after the construction started, and in 2010, the Nam Turn 2 achieved commercial operation, and now the project is up and running. Next, please. And so, from my experience, I would assess the achievement that for the host country, previously, hydropower project or electricity generation project was considered as infrastructure project, and no private sector could come in. The advent of the private financing in Nam Turn 2 and have the Lao government to realize the public sector program. For instance, many activities have been deregulated, and many activities have been privatized. And in addition to that, and the Lao government decentralized function from the central to the provincial government. For instance, the function to collect tax has been devolved to the local authority. The function to take care of environmental and social mitigation measures in the project also decentralized to the provincial government. And the host country, Laos do that because Nam Turn 2 is a versatile project. This is the first private funds project, the first platform, and whereby the host country could work with the private sector, for instance, the investor, the financial, the contractor, and the other participants involved in the project development. And this is the real and the first IPP invested on limited recourse financing in Laos. And next, and for the host country, as Nam Turn 2, the country, can you return back to the previous pages? Up. So Nam Turn 2 help the government to adjust public mechanism. For instance, the advent of Nam Turn 2, the government improve its taxing power so that the regulatory regime of the taxing power can have the private financing bankable. And next, please.
I may just to flag that we're just over time now, so if you could focus on wrapping up with the last points, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And so, and finally, and the Nam Turn 2 can make as the project cover many jurisdictions because the project developed in Laos and selling electricity in Thailand, and also the project borrowed money from banks domiciled in the other jurisdiction. So Nam Turn 2 is jurisdictional undertaking. And the other point is that Nam Turn supposed to be water-based, but Nam Turn 2, the development of Nam Turn 2 went beyond of the hydropower development to the social development, environmental social development, other infrastructure projects, and finally the financing and the process of development of Nam Turn 2 was transparent in respect of legal and environmental and social aspect. That's the end of the project. So next, please. So these are the projects. As you can see that the first picture taken in 1990. This is just before I left the project in 2009. That's what is change happening a lot. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very fascinating overview of a very specific example that makes this discussion very practical. Indeed, it's interesting to have kind of that historical development perspective, recognizing that some of these projects can take significant time, maybe not 100 years for all of them, but indeed these are long span developments, and helping to unpack for us the role of the different players, including private investors, what the government had to do in terms of legislation to assure an appropriate risk-adjusted return, and also the role of development banks. Very interesting example of an investment, transboundary investment that combines some commercial elements, but also some public good elements, and how that can be financed. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to our third presenter now, and this will be Ms. Kate Lamb. She's the Global Director of Water Security at the CDP. And we're going to shift gears a little bit. We've been talking about how to get financing to flow towards water projects. And now we want to look at the perspective of how we can consider water-related risks and also benefits from a perspective of integrating that into investment decision-making. So how can we align broader financing flows to go towards these types of investments, including transboundary investments? And Kate, we're very eager to hear from you on that. You also have 10 minutes. Let me pass the floor straight to you.
Great, thank you, Kathleen. And today, while I'm not going to be talking about the mainstream financial institutions that CDP is used to be generally engaging with, I'm going to be talking about our core work, which is around how the role of corporate transparency and how that can ultimately act as a tool or a prompt to motivate private sector actors to invest in basin health and transboundary cooperation. So next slide, please. I'd first like to start by giving those of you on the call today a little bit of an understanding of what CDP is, because we're perhaps not best well known to the traditional water community. We are a not-for-profit organization. We work to see a thriving economy that works for people and planet in the long term. And we do this by focusing investors, companies, and cities to take urgent action to build a truly sustainable economy by measuring, understanding, and reporting their environmental impact. So we deploy a different tool than pumps and pipes and taps and toilets, but one that we believe, and we have sufficient evidence to suggest that it is really effective in driving change and action on water security amongst private sector. Next slide, please. So the system for CDP works on a voluntary basis. Ultimately, there is no regulatory requirement at this stage for companies to report water-related information anywhere. And so in the absence of that requirement, we activate the capital markets or financial institutions, institutional investors, to provide the pressure and the encouragement for private sector companies to disclose, to report certain aspects of their business and how it relates to water issues. And importantly, the steps that those companies are taking to amend and invest in their business models, processes, and practices to deliver a water secure outcome, to ensure that they're mitigating the impacts that their business has on freshwater resources. We collect all of this information together in a centralized place and share it back to institutional investors who then use it to inform their engagement decisions and their investment practices. Next slide, please. At its basic and most sort of least grand, what this really looks like is a questionnaire. And we issue this questionnaire on an annual basis. And it's made up of a whole range of different questions. But the questionnaire essentially serves two purposes. The first is to collect business relevant water related data in standardized comparable format that we make available to the market. And the second, and arguably in my perspective, the most important and the most exciting, is to catalyze action within the responding entity, in this case, the company, to spark strategic dialogues on water that would not necessarily have happened if we hadn't asked them to. You can imagine when a question in a questionnaire is placed on the desk of a chairman of a company or chair of a company about the risks that that company is facing, it does spark conversations that may not have happened before. Next slide, please. And I get the great joy, of course, of designing that questionnaire. And this is the overall process and how it works. So at the top of this diagram, you see that we issue our information request, we issue the questionnaire. That sparks those conversations within companies. It encourages them to go and collect data that they may not have thought was important before, to find the keys to the meter room, to understand what a river basin is. They submit their response to us. We then score it and we publicly benchmark companies. Those benchmarks and the data is made available to the market. The companies are incentivized to innovate and improve their performance, and the whole process starts again. Next slide, please. So what does this look like for transboundary and basin level cooperation and investment? Well, about 5-6 years ago, we acknowledged that there were particular challenges around basin engagement by companies. Most of the companies that had been responding to our water questionnaire up until that point were unaware of river basin dynamics. They were unaware of the importance of river basin health to the health of their business. And as a result, they were not investing in projects to boost river basin health nor resilience. They were essentially following the track that Karen pointed out earlier of this concept of clean fish in a dirty pond. And we all knew, and generally they knew, that this was going to be insufficient to deal with their risks. And so I took the opportunity to design new questions that would spark a change in behavior. Next slide, please. One example of this is around the amount of revenue that is generated within river basins. As Karen mentioned earlier, one of the traditional issues around investing in basin development was that the ROI, traditional ROI, was not there. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an ROI. As we all know, the value of water resides more and beyond just a traditional return on investment. It resides in the ability of the company ultimately to fundamentally continue operating, to protect the revenue that it has become used to succeeding in achieving. So I designed this question, and it requires companies to disclose the number and proportion of facilities and the revenue associated with those facilities that are exposed to water-related risks that could have a financial or strategic impact on the business. And they have to do that by river basin. Now, if you look at the way in which companies have traditionally reported financial information in the past, they reported on a country level or on a product level. They have never, ever been required to report it at a basin level. Next slide, please. And that's where the innovation in this approach lies. Next, there's a few clicks on this one. So I mentioned scoring earlier. So the process of once a company has provided this information to us about the revenue generated by river basin and other revenue related information, we score them. And companies will only make it onto our water A list. the top of the rank, if you like, the gold medal podium in the Olympic Stadium that we've essentially constructed, if they calculate and disclose how much revenue is derived in each river basin that they depend upon, if they align risk assessments with river basin and stakeholder needs, if they involve river basin management authorities in water risk assessments, if they disclose substantive water risks and actions per river basin, and if they set science-based targets, although that's a forthcoming intervention once the methodologies are available and developed, once again ensuring that the targets and goals that companies are setting resonate with basin needs. Next slide, please. So what does all this mean? How has it driven change? What are the outcomes? Well, in 2020, we issued our questionnaire to 5,537 of the world's largest, most high impact companies. These are companies from metals and mining, oil and gas, energy production, food and bev, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, you name it, they're in our sample. And quite excitingly, 2,934, or just under 3,000, responded. That's not a bad response rate from my perspective, and we're really very proud of that. So what are they telling us when it comes to transboundary basin issues? Next slide, please. This is the split of the disclosure per country, as you'll see in front of you. And whilst you'll see a heavy leaning towards North America, it's worth noting that the growth in the number of companies providing this type of river basin information is also growing rapidly in the Asia Pacific region as well, which is really exciting. Next slide, please. So what they're telling us is that the business value at risk from water is higher than ever. The proportion of revenue that these companies are reporting at risk has grown this year and is anticipated to grow ever larger unless water security issues, of course, are dealt with. 75% of the world's largest 150 companies report that they are exposed to substantive water risks. And the word substantive is important here. These are not small scale interventions, small scale risks that the company can afford to bat off and move on from. These are risks that would pose a substantive issue for them if they were to materialize. And in response, and excitingly for us, and what's relevant for us today to see, is that the companies are reporting investing more than $100 billion in actions to mitigate water risks and impacts at the basin level. This is a source of the investment that we're ultimately looking for. And when we consider where that number was just 5 years ago, before we started asking this question about river basin revenue generation and the need for companies to feel that they have to protect that, this is a substantive growth in that number. Next slide, please. We take this information, river basin action and investment information, and share it free with the Water Action Hub as part of the UN Global Compact's CEO Water Mandate. This information is publicly available and ready for engaging in a relatively easy format in this tool. But it's safe to say that companies and investors are more aware of what a river basin is today than they ever have been. They are aware that the health of the river basin is synonymous with the health of the business itself, and that therefore investing in river basins makes sound strategic business sense. They are identifying projects and clearly taking action to mitigate these risks. What's not yet clear to us, however, at the moment, is whether these projects do contribute fundamentally to basin health or if they do not. And I think the next frontier for us as a community is to ensure that we harness these investments and ensure that they are working for more than just the business and that they are working for all of us and the communities that surround them. Next and final slide. So next steps, where can we take this? What does this mean? Well, I think from my perspective, and to give a bit of a boost for CDP, I think we clearly need to increase the number of companies and financial institutions that are disclosing to CDP. In the absence of regulatory requirements that will bring the basin into the boardroom, we offer that unique opportunity. We also have an opportunity worldwide to influence corporate disclosure regulations and rating agencies. There are a number of governments worldwide now that are looking to mandate corporate water disclosure. It's beholden on all of us to ensure that the metrics and the requirements of those disclosures have a basin level grounding within there. Otherwise, we may miss an opportunity if those metrics are kept to sort of quite simple metrics around wastewater reuse or total volumes of water withdrawn. Important information, no doubt, but if we ultimately want action in the river basin, we need to ensure that the basin level information is also required to be disclosed. We can scale up the adoption of science-based targets for freshwater and the AWS standard, the Alliance for Water Stewardship, to ensure that the corporate actions and investments that are taken are actually valid and, as I said, contributing towards and align with basin needs. Together, we can explore the ways in which we might better channel this $100 billion worth of investments. I can guarantee you that the majority of the companies that are making these investments are looking for ways in which they can get the best bang for their buck. And we know the best bang for their buck will be investing in the basin. And finally, and specifically on today's session, and the topic of the sessions, is that if you look at risk tools that companies are using at the moment, whether it's WWF's risk filter or WRI's aqueduct, the issue of transboundary cooperation doesn't feature as a risk driver or a lack of transboundary cooperation. And that might be one quite neat and small intervention, but meaningful intervention that we could make together. So next slide, I think, is just an inspiring picture. And I will say thank you to Kathleen and to the team for inviting me along today. And I'm really hoping for a fruitful conversation post presentation. Thanks, Kathleen.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Kate, and also keeping to time. That was fascinating overview, really the important and innovative niche that CDP has carved out there, demonstrating, I think, some points here around this very important element of awareness raising as a first place of starting, and how disclosure on a regular basis can drive that. But even more, what's striking to me is that that's happening at a river basin level. So this is very unique, but also the point of linking those risks then to financial information. So what is really the business value at risk? To me, that's the bottom line. And that's where you get this out of a technical discussion or sort of an environmental working group or corporate social responsibility and into a real financial decision-making discussion. And that can drive change. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to move on then to our fourth and final presenter. I'm very pleased to welcome Aaron Vermeulen, who is the head of green finance at WWF. And he has quite a wealth of experience and is going to share his views on the role of private financial actors in financing water-related projects under the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development. So this is a very interesting recent development. And Aaron, we're very much looking forward to hearing from you. Let's see, Aaron, do we have you on the stream? Do you have the stream?
Yes, I do. Hi, Kathleen.
Oh, there you go. Hello, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kathleen. Yes, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be in this interesting session, and also very excited to hear some of the messages of the previous presenters, because Karen was talking about, okay, how can we not see the private sector as a cash machine, but how should we develop incentives for the private sector to invest in water security? And then also the topic of water stewardship and disclosure on water-related topics for private sector companies is really important to catalyze water-related investments. So, so in a way, I'm happy I'm in the end, because DFCD is in a way trying to merge these concepts together and building on of the decade-long experience on private sector work in water-related investments. So next slide, please. Well, when we set up the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development, we did a kind of an analysis and started try to understand what are the current obstacles for private sector to come on board when it comes to water-related investments. And on this slide, you see a couple of steps in project finance. So it starts at the very early stage, where you start discovering potential leads for private sector investments. Then you go to a more developed phase where you start qualitatively identify the income sources, the market, to a full-scale business plan. And then, of course, you go to the finance stage where you find an investor or a bank to invest to the post-financing stage. And in each of these steps, we've seen that there are obstacles currently that prevent private sector to get on board when it comes to water-related investment. And so I'll guide you quickly through these 5 steps. So at the discover phase, we see there's still a lack of information on the climate-related and water security-related risks in water basins. And yes, disclosure is getting better. Information with tools like the water risk filter is getting better, but still we lack information, and we lack all the stakeholders in these basins to agree on what are the basin-related risks. And then also we see that companies that are operating in these basins or are sourcing from these basins, they're not always aware of the risks, and they don't know how to act on them to reduce these water-related risks. Then when we go to the structure phase, then we see there's also a lack of capacity to translate these risks into business-related risks, and also identify what are the appropriate solutions and which of these solutions can actually be bankable or investable. And then even when potential investable ideas, projects, or companies have been identified, then there's a lack of legal, technical, financial expertise and capacity to develop these ideas into a solid investment proposition. Then when this investment proposition is actually there, and when we have found a company or a project, then we go to the financial sector, and then the perception of the financial sector on the risk-return profile of some of these companies or projects is not always aligned with the mandates they are allowed to invest in. So think about regulatory risk, political risk, but also project or financial risks. And then also there's not always access to concessional finance, blended finance available to de-risk some of these commercial investors. And then after the actual financial deal has been done, we still see that there's a lack of understanding by businesses to build truly sustainable projects where inclusivity, when it comes to local communities, when it comes to environmental protection, is lacking. So what the Dutch Fund for Climate and Development is actually doing is setting up an instrument to overcome these different obstacles. And I'm going to explain that in the coming couple of slides to you. So next slide, please. So the Dutch Fund of Climate and Development is actually a financial facility consisting of 3 sub-facilities. So in the middle, you see the origination facility, which is the facility that is undertaking the first 3 steps, which you saw on the previous slide. This facility can be seen as a project motor, where we look at the basin-related risks. We try to identify potential investees. We support these investees with the development of business ideas and bring them to the investors. And we have 2 investors. One is called Climate Fund Managers. They are running the water facility with a 75 million euro amount of grant money coming from the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs to de-risk commercial finances into water-related infrastructure. And then we have the FMO, the Dutch Entrepreneurial Development Bank, who is running a land use facility to do actually the same as Climate Fund Managers, deploying 55 million euros to de-risk commercial deals in developing countries. We have 4 investment themes. One is water, one is environmental protection. Then we are also looking at agricultural projects, and the last one is forestry. And as you will know, all of these sectors are closely linked to water-related issues. So we believe that if we design these projects together with the private sector, taking the basin context into consideration, we can contribute to water security and transboundary cooperation. Next slide, please. So we have a stage gate process. As I said earlier, we always start at the landscape level. So we take the river basin, transboundary or not, as a starting point. And in these landscapes, river basins, we start mapping climate-related risks for local stakeholders. We engage stakeholders, public, private, local communities to get a kind of a consensus of what is needed. And then we quite quickly translate these risks into solutions and identify opportunities for private sector investment. We have a stage gate process. We go from discover, structure to develop. And then in stage 3, we go to financing and implementation of the project. We have grants available for private sector companies in stage 1 and stage 2. And in these grants, there's also money available to look at issues outside the fence line of the projects around regulation, engaging stakeholders in the river basins. Next slide, please. So one example is this example from South Africa. In this landscape, we're working together with a dairy producer, Danone. We're working together with dairy companies supplying dairy to Danone. And we're looking at the basin-related issues there. Degradation of grassland, degradation of soil is definitely an issue there. So what we're doing there is building business cases for more sustainable production of dairy in that region, providing grants to local dairy producers to irrigate the grassland differently, more sustainably, restore the local soil health, and also look at the energy use in their processing factories. There are a couple of incentives for both the buyers and producers. The buyer, Danone in this case, is getting better quality dairy to their factory. Then also Danone can claim some impacts in the landscapes in terms of better water stewardship, but also carbon sequestration in the supply chain. And then the dairy producers have a cost saving because of the energy saving in their storage and processing factories. Plus, the production is going up because of better soil health and animal health as well. So what the Dutch Fund for the Climate and Development is doing in this case is providing grants to the dairy producers, developing the business case, doing pilots, and in the end scale up to a bigger community of dairy producers and set up a financing facility to get access to finance to invest on one hand in energy efficiency in processing mills, but also in irrigation system on the ground. Next slide, please. So what we've done to inspire potential investees, but also non-profits working with private sector worldwide, is we set up a blueprint on bankable nature solutions, showing proven concepts all across the world in these 4 investment themes. So I invite you to have a look at that blueprint guide. And then to finish off, we opened a so-called opportunity window where we are very open. So that's the next slide. So we're very open to ideas from private and non-profits on bankable ideas that are eligible for DFCD. So if it's in one of the 4 investment themes in river basins, if it's potentially bankable, we're very interested to work with you. So that's my very short pitch, Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Aaron. I think you're going to get, I hope, some interesting responses from all those participants listening. Sounds great to hear the updates of how the DFCD has been developing, and indeed very helpful for you to outline sort of the range of different obstacles that can block or make it difficult to, in fact, have a pipeline of bankable, attractive projects. And also explaining to us how these can be addressed and how the design of the DFCD tries to address those obstacles all along the course of project origination through financing. That's really exciting. And again, you're bringing out that element of how the de-risking approach can be used to then crowd in additional funds from the private side. So that's very interesting. Great to hear about the process and also some specific examples. So thank you very much for that. Now, before we turn to questions, we've had some questions coming through the chat. So we have a few already ready for our panelists. But before we get to those, I'd like to give the floor to our responding expert, actually. And we're very fortunate now to have the perspective of an investor. You know, we've been talking about what we can do to bring investors in. Well, we're here to hear directly from you, Piet, on this. Piet Klopp is a senior advisor of responsible investment at PPGM, a pension fund. And he's going to comment, reacting hopefully to some of the points in the presentations, but also other points of discussion. And you have about 5 minutes, I think, Piet, and then we'll head to Q&A. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. Thank you for this honor, the responding expert, no less. This is a great panel, and Aaron and the background paper are spot on. You know, there's nothing to add from my perspective as, you know, one of the employees of a Dutch institutional investor. I think there's a few things that I'd like to comment on. One is that indeed, by CDP and others, information is all grist to our mill. Investors certainly don't understand water fully, but they do understand risk. And more granular information on especially water security or lack thereof is a very important thing to improve our understanding and perhaps also increase our actions in this field. So boiling down water risk to water security and perhaps even transboundary water security and express that in a value at risk is a very important ingredient in our investment process. That doesn't mean that pension funds will ride to the rescue. You know, we understand risk, but there's certainly a limit to how much and how keen we are on, you know, plunging in, you know, tricky countries around a very difficult issue, water, and invest in sizable solutions. We do that in various ways. You know, we've got about 2 billion euros invested in water one way or the other. The bulk of that is in listed equities, though. So there's relatively little in project finance. And that's for, you know, all the familiar reasons that, you know, the background paper elaborates on. There is, though, a few things that we can add to the table. One of them, I think, was alluded to by Kate. Ideally, I think on the back of, you know, a better understanding of water risk, investors could be listed in a lobby for more meaningful, more rational water governance, reducing those water security risks. And I think having investors on your side is probably a useful thing to have in lobbying governments, also in transboundary river management. So that's one thing. We can team up with companies, NGOs, etc., for better water governance. The other thing I believe we can do is try to make more of the opportunity that's in front of us. Capital in some of our countries has never been less cheap, or more cheap, I should say, less expensive. So, you know, there really is an opportunity now more than ever to issue water bonds. And provided they're being issued by credit-worthy agents, this is the sort of thing that pension funds love more than anything. Because, you know, this is our game. It's big and boring. You know, that's what we like to invest in. Sizable, chunky investments. And of course, this kind of pushes the the challenge of coming out with investable projects to organizations like WWF and its partners. But still, investors are waiting for that kind of opportunity. Big and boring is the name of the game, in our book at least. I think there's one more thing I'd like to say about more project-specific finance. Of course, we are rather unpopular amongst many initiators of water projects in that we have an endless variety of saying no. And personally, I feel pretty guilty about that, and yet there is something that I believe is an approach that perhaps has a better chance of success. Many of these good ideas run into very tightly defined investment mandates. So these are things that we can't even invest in because there is no room and no agreement to do that from our clients. So what we should perhaps be doing, and that's partly on our side, we should be fully transparent as to what we can invest in, and then perhaps offer that as a starting point to tailor specific proposals. Because otherwise, everybody is spending a lot of time for an eventual no to many of these ideas. So transparency on what investors are allowed to invest in, I think, is an important part of this challenge. And I'll leave it at that. There's more time for questions that way, perhaps.
So much, Jet. I mean, extremely practical and very valuable sort of reality check from the investor perspective. Of course, setting expectations that we can't expect pension funds to ride in and save the day for water security, but there are indeed important links here, and understanding, the type of language and the type of analysis that captures investors' attention, translating that water risk into value at risk probably can't be overstated. Indeed, I like your point around big and boring, how that can be so attractive to institutional investors. And indeed, there's a lot of big and boring in the water infrastructure space. So that's excellent and great to hear you, elaborate on some of the vehicles, the green bonds, the water bonds that can be used, and also how investors' voices can be used to sort of push that debate and the drive for better water management and governance. So we have a few questions that have already come through, and we've got a couple of questions here I'd like to start with. I'll give 2 questions actually, and then we'll invite the panelists to raise their hand if they want to come in, and Diane will give you the stream then if you raise your hand. It'd be great to hear, very quick responses from all the panelists if possible. And one of the questions is a bit of a general question. It says, how can, so it's great to hear all these, potential opportunities and getting the private sector involved, but really what's the key to unlocking private sector investment in water resources management and cooperation? We've heard a number of barriers, we've heard a number of approaches, but what do you see as maybe the 1 or 2 main keys to unlocking that if we force you to choose? So that would be one question. And I'm going to also give you a second question related to how can we make sure that the private sector and private funds and investors are also respecting the principles of international law governing the use of transboundary water? Is there a need for code of conduct here? Is there a need for more awareness raising here? What are your thoughts on that? So 1 or 2 key points to really unlock private sector investment, and then how we make sure that the private sector is respecting the principles around managing transboundary resources. So we have Karen, who's raised her hand, and I'd like to invite her first and then move to Kate to respond. Kate and then Aaron. So Karen, Kate, and Aaron.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for all the participants for the chat and the questions. I'll try to be brief. 3 points. in response. So one is in the framing. I think when you're looking at water resource management, investments in transboundary basins, is to think to how to frame it, right? The private sector comes at it in a different perspective. So 2030 Water Resources Group, what we do is we create multi-stakeholder platforms across government, private sector, civil society to work together. And this is where project finance can come in, because you have the dynamics built across these different actors. But it's very focused on a few areas, right? Industrial water, urban water management, agriculture and water management, mining and water. So I think just something to think about. I wouldn't come at it from the broader water resource management. It's coming in these areas that then link into the broader processes in transboundary basins, and to frame it that way, I think, is important. And that's where I think project finance can come in. Second point is, because governments are part of river basin organizations, is also to encourage governments to value water. We've been working with the government of Bangladesh, where we have a multi-stakeholder platform that has been really leading on the issue of valuing water. And this came from the high-level panel on water that was done a few years ago. So I think that signal to governments also is to process and develop processes around valuing water, then also sends a signal to private sector to come in on investments. And then on Piet's point, I think also on the water governance, absolutely cannot agree more. There needs to be a effort in terms of has to come from water governance reforms. So I'm not sure if some sort of a document is needed necessarily, because again, it's within the basin context. Let's keep in mind also, many companies are very decentralized. So it really means engaging with the private sector companies within the particular basins and bringing their different parts of their operations together, and then building those trust dynamics, I think, is a key step forward.
Thank you so much for those three very powerful points, Karen. And now I'd like to give the floor to Kate to come in, and then we'll go to Aaron.
Thank you, Kathleen. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Oh, looks like you just...
There you go, back again.
There we go. We've got the stream again. All right, back to you. We hear you well.
Thank you. So from my perspective, clearly, if it didn't come across strongly enough in the presentation, corporate transparency at a river basin level, asking key information about the revenue generated per river basin, I think holds a really significant opportunity to unlock potential and ensure that companies become aware of the importance of river basin health to the fundamental health of their business, and are therefore inspired to invest. The second piece for me, or a major driver that is really lacking within the private sector theory of change, if you like, at the moment, is more serious threats to their reputation. Now, if you imagine, or if you cast your mind back to try and think about the last time major corporations, on either individually or on a sector basis, were shamed for their performance or practices on freshwater resources, you'd have to cast your mind back quite a long way to find those. The last one that I'm aware of was published in 2011, which was Greenpeace's Dirty Laundry campaign aimed at the apparel sector. Every single company will tell you, almost every single company, and certainly most commercial banks will tell you, that if you want to drive action amongst their then you have to hit the reputation. You have to make it a reputational issue. So I would encourage all on the call to begin looking more and shouting about what you see in terms of both positive, but importantly, malpractice that's taking place, because there is not enough of it. Reputational risk generally features as a very low driver within, or perceived risk within, the risk profiles that companies are disclosing to CDP every year. We have to change that. In terms of making the case for companies to meet their regulatory obligations when it comes to the use of transboundary waters, I sent a response in the comments or in the chat, but I think there is an element that they may not be aware of their obligations. And I think there's value, of course, in all of us water professionals telling them that they have these obligations. However, there's something incredibly powerful when the messenger is one from the legal profession. And if we commission a legal profession to write the legal case for why boards of pension funds need to take this issue seriously, then the cascade effect down into the corporate space is really significant. And we're seeing this deployed in the climate space quite significantly, but not in the water community at the moment. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Very insightful points in terms of what can drive change there and targeting where you think those key action points are. Erin, please, over to you. Erin, do you have the stream? I don't think we see you yet.
Kathleen, it's coming through.
Okay.
Like, yeah, it might take
Great.
a few more seconds, but you should get the stream.
Sorry for the technical hiccups. Maybe I'm there now 3 times, Kathleen, sorry. Do you hear me?
We see you in double.
I don't know what
we get a double dose of you.
Maybe I clicked one time too often. Am I still there?
You're here. We see you. Just
Okay.
one of you.
So, of course, I mean, it goes without saying that better regulation is definitely an incentive for private sector to invest, right? So, but Karen already said that. I think also more transparency and disclosure on what's related risk in global supply chains is another important one. But then what I see too often is, yes, global companies, sourcing companies, they are aware and they report on their water-related risk, but they don't, when it comes to then actually finding solutions on the ground in these basins, we need them to put skin in the game. So they can smoothen some of these investments by providing purchase agreements with suppliers. They can maybe be co-investors, or they can push local regulators to regulate better to de-risk these investments. So that's one thing I keep on missing. But then secondly, companies in the end they produce milk, dairy, clothes, metals and mining, and they're not in the world to understand water and water-related investments. So I think you need to build unusual consortia like the one of DSD, where non-profits are working with financials and are working with corporates to structure these deals and design these deals so that they also make sense in the context of a river basin. And so I think you will need more facilities like we've set up in DFCD to make that happen. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Erin. Very, very good points there. And indeed, we're starting to run a bit over time. We'll have maybe a couple of more minutes before we need to wrap up. We had a couple of specific questions in the chat, one directed to Kate that we wanted to ask, and one directed to you, Erin. So actually, why don't you stay here since you're on the stream? And let me put that question to you. Just going to go back to that. So if Erin can stay, come back on the stream, let me just take advantage to ask him a question from Nadine Fragnier. And she had a question around the sustainability strategy adopted for the dairy project. And she wants to know a little bit more about that, noting that often beneficiaries relying on grants would not continue their practices after the project duration. So how do you make that more long-lasting? What kind of support is given to them in order to actually demonstrate a valuable business case to make that more sustainable going forward? If you can elaborate a few points on that case related to dairy, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for that question. So I think we have two strategies to make sure that the project is actually going to deliver. So I think she's right in saying, well, if it would just be grant based, then there are questions on the sustainability of the impact. But what we're doing with the grants that we deploy in this origination facility is to quantify the impact, build capacity, and make the business case for the impact. And then by the time we've come up with evidence that this is good business case, both from the financial side and the impact side, we will scale that up to an actual loan or an equity investment. That loan or equity will come with strings attached by FMO or climate fund managers, which on one hand, they will make sure that the best environmental and social safeguards are being respected, but also there will be a monitoring and evaluation system attached to the deal, so we can also monitor the impacts of the actual investment in the long run.
Okay, nice, very good, excellent. So thank you, Aaron, for expanding on that. And I'd like to ask Kate to join us on the stream to respond to a specific question directed towards her, asking about examples of the scope or type of water-related investments that have been made by companies who are reporting to you. If you can give some examples that maybe go beyond just CSR. So, how does that disclosure, those discussions, how are they driving corporates to make decisions? If you could say a few words on that, and then I'll have a last question for Pete, and then I think we'll wrap up. Kate, over to you.
Sure, thank you. And a great question. In terms of specific examples, that are a range, as you might imagine. Some of them range from reforestation investments in river basin restoration projects, or the protection and restoration of wetlands. Others are enabling improvements in water infrastructure and supporting the improvements in water infrastructure for communities around for particular facilities. This is in a case in the Vaal River system, for example. Other companies are making really quite bold commitments in terms of reducing, or in fact eliminating, their demands from non-renewable groundwater sources in India, and reaching radical improvements there, therefore reducing the vulnerability of all that depend on that resource. And how we test whether these are sort of CSR or not is that we, in addition to capturing river basin context-based information, we also ask about the corporate structures and governance mechanisms that are being put in place. And that is a true indicator of how serious these companies are. One of the questions we asked is around board-related incentives. And if generally we're seeing an increase in the number of CEOs that have her or his remuneration package based on really material outcomes from a water perspective. That's really exciting. Again, you see that real genuine buy-in from the board level all the way through to the boiler room, if you like. And what we know is that CEOs that have incentives tied to water at that level are much more likely to achieve their water-related ambitions and goals, and move the concept from this CSR style intervention to fundamental business model redesign and structure.
Excellent, thanks, Kate. Some promising examples there. And I'd like to finish by actually asking a question to Piet. So our investor has the final word in this discussion. And then we're going to wrap up, because there's a very interesting session starting in a few minutes on innovative financing mechanisms. So stay with us for that, please. And Piet, the question to you is this: institutional investors, you said they like big and boring, and we heard at the very beginning from Karen and from other speakers that actually water investments can be very complex, and this is one of the issues with getting finance into this sector. And notably in the transboundary context, you can add an additional layer of complexity, if you will, multiple partners, multiple jurisdictions, multiple governments, etc. Can you make transboundary investments big and boring? What do you think? You have the last word here.
Well, I would be inclined to say, this is almost the exact opposite of big and boring. Boundary river basin management is nothing but adventurous. However, this idea of bond financing could turn this into something that is big and boring, at least for us. Not necessarily for the ones who run the projects, but once you aggregate them into a bond, we buy the bond and we're done. So it's not just the subject matter or the action on the ground, because that is by definition complex. It's a public good. Transboundary makes it more complex still, but our exposure to that set of issues and challenges could be quite simple, really, and could be attractive to a big institutional investor. So the exposure can be big and boring, The action, but that's not something that we typically get involved in on the ground, could be the exact.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think you're quite right there. There's a distance to go between the actual project development on the ground and all the intermediary steps that can make that financing opportunity attractive to the big and boring investor on the other end of the channel, which is an important role, I would say, for what we call intermediaries. So making that bridge between who's driving the projects on the ground, potentially aggregating them at the right scale, structuring the risk and the return profiles of the investment, and driving the vehicles that then can attract the investment from the other side. But I think that's, in my view, an excellent point actually to wrap up on. And just want to say thank you so much to all of the speakers, all of the presenters, our expert, and above all, of course, our participants who provide a number of very interesting questions. Please have a look at the chat. And we'll go ahead and wrap up there, and signaling that the next session on innovative financing instruments comes next. So I hope you enjoy that. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Kathleen, for this very interactive and active moderation. And now we will move on to session 4. So I will invite our new moderator, Mr. Stefan Hart, Senior Loan Officer at the European Investment Bank. And Stefan, if you can hear me, I will give you now the stream.
Right, hello. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can, and we can also see you perfectly.
Right, look, I just thank the previous session. That was really, really interesting, and it just shows how important it is for all sides, the public and private, to really understand where the other is coming from, to understand what drives them, the mandates, and how that translates, you might say, into engagement and finding the right incentives. So just a bit about myself. My name is Stephen Hart. I've been at the European Investment Bank for 15 years. I currently work for the infrastructure and climate finance team. I have a past, in fact, in the water sector. So I spent much of 20 years, in fact, working with water and sanitation and transboundary water issues. Now, the session we're going into now, very interesting. We have 5 speakers, all 5 speakers, and whereas we're looking at the needs, you might say, and the traditional financing sources, the topic of PPP, what we're looking at now is really some of the more innovative out-of-the-box features that could be interesting, and how to turn that into something we can use for Transboundary. So the 5 speakers we have today, we have Federico Cordon, who represents a long-standing water corporation in Central America, coming from the Trifino Trinational Commission, followed by Hugo Contreras, who comes from the Nature Conservancy. Now, we know them very well, of course, because they've been very active in water funds, and really how to take this to the next level, how to go transboundary with these structures. Also from the Nature Conservancy, Fernando Miralles, who will look at the nexus. Now we hear about the nexus, energy, food, water, and really how, when we look beyond other interests, just rather than familiar sector that we work with, how do we get these other interests to play into our sectors and create new opportunities, right? Now, we're going to finish the session looking at the blue peace movement, which is how to capitalize, you might say, on the potential peace dividend from water corporation. And we'll be hearing from Jaffa Makano, Global Manager from the UNCDF, and Ndaw Ababakar from the OMBG from the Gambia River organization. So at the end of this session, we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. Now, much like the previous sessions, we'll be picking up the questions from the chat, and you can raise your hand. And in the interest of time, I think we should move ahead. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Again, Latin America, great source of innovation in cooperation. So I'd like to hear from Mr. Federico Cordon.
Stefan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry to interrupt you. So I think Federico Cordon is taking a bit of time to getting connected. So what we will do is that we will go directly to the second speaker, so Mr. Hugo from the Nature Conservancy, and we'll go back to to the first speaker right after, if you're fine with that,
Of course.
not to lose time. Okay, thanks a lot.
You have 7 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, and apologies for the light. It's still dark. And if I may, I will make the presentation in Spanish as it is stated. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I just want you to confirm whether you have my presentation, whether it can be shown on the screen.
Hugo, can you hear me? Sorry, we are just putting through your PPT. It will appear in less than 30 seconds. And I just take this opportunity to remind you that when you want us to move to the next slide, you can just say it orally. Like this, we can just move to the next slide. Okay, thanks a lot. I think it's on now. Thanks.
Thank you.
So the main question is, how can water funds support this experience that we have been doing in the Inter-American Bank and the FEMSA Association through the Latin American Association for Water Funds, and how can this be used in transboundary water management? Next one, please. So the basic questions that we ask ourselves in every water fund is, how can we attract new actors with a common vision, understanding that the challenge for the water challenge is a complex challenge that requires collective action and then the participation of different actors as well. The second series of questions are related to the solution. That is, what is the type of solutions that are more adequate in order to address the issues of the basin and especially the integrated water management. Then the third question would be, how can we identify the positive incentives that are modeling people's security and people perception? So we have to ask ourselves questions about public policies. And then finally, how can we attract financial mechanisms in the long term so that they can help us to fund all of the actions that we are developing? Next one, please. So what is a water fund? This is a collective mechanism that designs financial mechanisms and governance approaches that contributes to an integrated management of the water basin, where the users in the top of the basin and like upstream and downstream are connected. And they can establish a conversation on how to manage water resources so that they can both get benefits and that the users can also get the benefits, and that everybody, those who are in charge of managing water funds and water sources, get their benefits as well. So one of the most important aspects of these water funds mechanisms is that it establishes shared long-term actions to help the execution of actions, and therefore we can come up with attractive solutions to get financing. Next one, please. One of the additional elements of water funds is that it gathers together the conventional approaches of water management in the past, like traditional infrastructure, together with past solutions based on nature, as has been already shown, and this is already necessary in order to do a proper management of the basin. Next one, please. So the idea of water funds was born in Quito in the year 2000, at least in Latin America.
and the Inter-American Development Bank and the FEMSA Foundation and Nature Conservancy, with the support of the Global Environment Facility, and together with all of these associations, created the Latin American Association for Water Funds, that has as a purpose to create funds in the whole region, and there are different functionalities of all of the partners. So these water funds impact on the governance. They promote collective mechanisms, and they implement long-term solutions. These are the added values of this water fund. Next one, please. In the case of the Trifinio, we've done shared work, and there was a lot of work done gathering together different stakeholders. There is a strategic plan. We developed different actions to help creating and developing technical skills, information, testing solutions. That is, in the years during which Trifinio has been working, we gathered together a series of assets that allowed us to be used at this time and to group them in such a way that they can help us to create not only a water fund, but also to help us understand how to attract long-term funding. Next one, please. And the basic question is then, how can we attract sustainable funding for a mechanism like this? Even though we don't have the answer for this, and the water fund is still being created and developed, I mean, we're still doing the feasibility analysis for the Trifinio area, but there are at least three elements that have to be considered in order to attract funding. The first one is whether we can redirect the financial resources through things that already exist, that is, taxes and fees that are paid by the different users and by the different communities. The second aspect is whether we can redirect the credit mechanisms so that the costs of the basin integrated management can be also assumed by credits that the international financial organizations are already offering for this area. There is some experience in Brazil and in Panama about attempts, whereas we tried to gather a portfolio of solutions based on nature associated to a potential credit. And the last one, which is, of course, the most challenging one, is how can we monetize and translate into money, the co-benefits generated by the different users, and how to group them so that we can use them and subject them to different funding mechanisms. Next one, please. And in the case of Trifinio, just considering one of the slides by Mr. Cardon, there has already been we have already done a study that shows the associated benefits to, for instance, stopping sedimentation can be related to an increase in agricultural productivity, and they amount to $600 million. Then there are some associated benefits as well that are related to a better management of the water basin, and this would prevent the accumulation of sediments in the hydroelectric power facilities, and this could be identified as something that could be translated into money. And there is an example in Salvador, on the other side of the slide. There are certain funds in Salvador that had been promoted by Capability Services, and these mechanisms are already generating financial flows because they improved the agricultural practices. So the farmers are ready to invest resources in order to improve water management. And then with these resources, they can improve the productivity of their coffee crops, for instance. And all these resources are also being translated into money. And then together with this association, we are performing a study in order to understand how to monetize the benefits for the investments on these facilities in Colombia, and how to generate contracts whereby payments are made based on the results. These are only some ideas that we can put on the table in the case of Trifinio. And next one, I think, is the last one.
Thank you.
Stefan, we cannot hear you.
Right, it seems the intended first speaker has not yet arrived, so we'll see if we can line up the following speakers.
Indeed, Stefan. So we will just move to the next speaker, Fernando Miralles. So I'll let you introduce him. Thanks a lot.
Right. So Mr. Fernando Miralles, also from the Nature Conservancy, will now delve into the question of how to deploy, you might say, this concept of the nexus in favor of transboundary water cooperation. So I give you the floor, Mr. Miralles.
Yes.
You have 7 minutes.
Absolutely. No, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity. I think the first thing I'll say is that this session is about investments and financing, and I know very little about investing and certainly nothing about financing. I'm a scientist. I always welcome the opportunity to talk to people and communities outside of my area of expertise, because I think that a big gap that we have is in the ability to communicate with each other and have these communities connect. And this is a great opportunity. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how water, energy, food, ecosystems, nexus investments can be an opportunity to finance transboundary water projects, and actually how transboundary water projects can become a great opportunity to make investments in the water sector through a nexus approach. So next. So if you look up nexus, in the literature and do an internet search, you're going to find a million diagrams like this. I think the overall concept of the nexus is that traditional planning in the water sector, in the food sector, in the energy sector is done in many cases very independently. If you go to a country, there's a Ministry of Energy, there's a Ministry of Agriculture, there's probably a Ministry of or an Agency of Water. Each of these agencies does their planning independently. The issue is that these resources do not operate independently. For example, to produce food, you need water and you need energy. To produce energy, you need water. To deliver water, you need energy. So when you plan these systems independently, you are bound to find conflicts. And then we have a shortage of water, energy, or food, which happens very constantly. And then we throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, Mother Nature, or there's a scarcity. There is a fundamental issue with the way we're doing planning, which translates into a fundamental issue in how we make investments, in how we actually finance these projects. And that's what the Nexus approach is able to try to reconcile. And that's it. And I think transboundary water basins offer a great opportunity to implement something like this. Next, I want to give you just a few examples, just a snippet of things that are going on. So so let's click through this. So this is a project. Let's click a couple of more times so the whole thing shows up. Sorry about that. So this is a study that was led by the World Bank in the Middle East and North Africa region. It's the most water-scarce region on Earth. It's heavily overexploited transboundary groundwater systems. But at the same time, the countries there in the region are working to expand their food and energy investments. Okay, so they food production and power generation are big priorities for this region. Yet they don't have the enough water resources to do this. In this study in particular, we look seriously at groundwater as a resource. There's very, very, very little surface water available in any of these countries that can be used. And we were able to determine, supply curves for groundwater at a very detailed level. One of the issues that came up in one of the recent discussions is from investors is not having enough data, not having enough information available. I think sometimes it's just we're not communicating properly, because a lot of the information that you may need to do these granular investments are probably there. So this is one example. Let me switch over to the next. In this case, let's click one more time. So in this case, we were able to quantify the investments required in the food and energy sectors across these countries that were limited by water. And so when you look at water at the transboundary level, you can find some very interesting spaces for investments and needs and infrastructure in other sectors that are not water. In this case, that was the lesson learned. Next. So here's another case, a little bit more recent, in the Zambezi River Basin. This is 8 countries, about 47 million people, again, with very ambitious development investments planned. So the SAMCOM, the River Basin Commission, has laid out a 20-year plan. In this study, when we looked at, when you look at the 8 countries and what the basin wanted to do, what ended up happening when you do all the accounting, and this is done through the Nexus approach, is that you can't do all these investments as they were planned. So looking at a Nexus approach allowed the Zambezi River Commission to prioritize these investments over the next 20 years and decide what can be done first. Next. This is another example in the Niger River Basin. 130 million people, 9 countries. Again, a similar set of questions. Each country has individual development plans in individual sectors. How do you reconcile this? How do you answer questions like is there just enough water to do all of these things at the same time? Or even in a planned sequence. When you look at a Nexus approach, the most likely outcome that you're going to get is that you're going to have to prioritize, and the sequence is going to have to change. And in this study, the investments and also not only the investments required, but actually the economic benefits that could be reaped from each of these sectors were quantified. Next. This is a project that the Nature Conservancy is starting to do with the Inter-American Development Bank in the Amazon River Basin. I think what's unique about the Amazon River Basin, in addition to as in differences, for example, with the Zambezi, with the Middle East, and with the Niger, is that in addition to food, water, energy needs, you have a serious biodiversity population. So I put here it's 45 million people, but you have 30,000 plant species, 1,000 fish species. So that's an important resource that needs to be leveraged too, particularly as these countries want to develop bioeconomy lines of investment. So here, this is a project we're just starting. We're going to try to, again, look at a Nexus approach to look at water, energy, food, and biodiversity, and try to see how we prioritize this in a strategic plan and in investments over a horizon of time. Next. So this is my last slide, and this is more, a few reflections for discussion. It's, I think the Nexus represents like an evolution of the integrated water resources management approach. In integrated water resources management, you actually consider other sectors, but you don't consider how those other sectors are changing and evolving, and how they're doing their own planning over time. And I think that leads to potential issues of conflicting issues in terms of how sustainable these plans can be. I think the Nexus defies traditional sectoral thinking. It defies traditional management. It defies traditional institutions. But I do think the transboundary systems offer important opportunities for investments across these sectors, and I think that's a conversation that needs to be had. The Nexus approaches help detect inconsistencies in sectoral and national development plans, and definitely allows to redefine investments like we did see in the Zambezi, like we did see in the Niger, and certainly in the Middle East as well. And this is the Nexus concept that's evolving more to encompass a wider set of issues beyond water, energy, and food. It's issues of climate. We haven't it's climate change is an umbrella that sort of permeates this whole thing. And then so we call the clues network, with the S being for socioeconomics. And I have one more slide that I wanted to show just to give you. It's the importance of humans. So this is some recent work that my team worked on, and when we look at the projection of water scarcity, and this is a 2050 projection, over 60% of basins around the world are going to face serious water scarcity that is not climate driven, that is human driven. So it is human demand for agriculture, for power generation, for water supply, that is driving scarcity. So this is a great opportunity to really redirect course, and I think the Nexus approach will provide those opportunities. And again, for the investment community, for the financing community, the message that I can convey is the following: the majority of data and information that you need to make better investments and better decisions is probably available. When I hear this thing that we have no data, I throw my hands up in the air, because my rule of thumb as a scientist is that whatever data you needed to make decisions today was probably available 10 years ago. You either don't know about it or have been communicated about it. And I take responsibility as a scientist for not being able to communicate that properly. So I'll pause there, shut up, and thanks again for the opportunity. This has been a very interesting set of conversations.
We're able to get Federico Cordon, or we'll proceed to the blue piece process.
Thanks, Stefan. We still don't have. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we still don't have Federico Cordon, unfortunately. So we will just proceed with the two next presentation from.
All right. So
CDF.
Well, the next one will be Jaffa Makano to introduce the whole concept and the work of the UNCDE in this space.
Hi.
You have 10 minutes, by the way.
Good evening. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll present Blue Peace mechanism, and Mr. Ndao will talk from the River Basin approach. And I want to thank the opportunity and for presenting to the organizers, and really appreciative of that. Next slide, please. I will split my presentation in three main sections. First is to understand where Blue Peace approach comes from, and then we will discuss the financial mechanism that we are presenting, and then a little bit on the Blue Peace Index, which measures the progress of how river basins become better organized, arranged, and peaceful coordination. Next slide. So the approach started with a global, started before, but a global high-level panel for water and peace issued a report. Next slide, please. And in the report, it was very clear that, yes, water is very well known from the humanitarian perspective and water usage perspective. However, as an instrument of cooperation, especially for the transboundary water, whether it's a river basin or a lake or an aquifer, there's still more work to be done. There is good examples where cooperation has been done in sharing water and hence produce peaceful arrangement, but there's a lot of others which have a long way to go. So the report did push an ability to transform water into becoming an instrument of cooperation and peace. Again, to look at it, like the speaker before me has just said, an integrated way, but now we have more scientific understanding that water has to become, has to be used sustainably and in a more circular manner, where as much as we can, we get to reuse water to a certain point. We are also looking at water as multi-sectorial, not water from the Ministry of Water perspective only, but also drinking water, agriculture, manufacturing, and few others. And also, because of the transboundary nature, it's regional perspective. So countries do have a say on the effect of one another, especially on the investment side. And we found this to be probably one of the biggest obstacles of financing because of having a common positioning within financing. So in a nutshell, Blue Peace, the reason we're calling it a movement is because it brings a lot of different stakeholders in place. We look at diplomatic, political, technical, and of course, financial. We see the financial and financing instrument as the end of the process. And these other areas tend to take a precedent of necessity for financing to come in. Next, please. I've talked about this already. Next. So at the heart of financial innovation for Blue Peace is this understanding that for Transboundary, there's a need of quite a few aspects to come together so that financing, in a lack of better word, can sit on top of it. So the first, and I'll say mostly, you need master plans that have already been agreed by the countries. So out of the political agreements and the regulations on how the river basin will operate and the operational mechanism, but there is a need of having an agreed master plan that then drives the investment plan. Because we all know, especially for the river basin, it's a little different for lakes and aquifer. The nature of being upstream, wanting to do hydroelectric, and the nature of being downstream, wanting to do agriculture, and the interrelation between the different perspective of investment, leave alone the drinking water, navigation channels, and the like. So the point of agreement that these investments are actually in one river basin and will be driven by one master plan is really the juxtaposition between the political agreements of using water as a cooperative unit and a measure of peace to the financing. Because then when a financier gets to understand all these other things have already been agreed, and they can be seen on how the institutional management of the river basin is managing the master plan and its joint investment plan. Next, please. So a little bit more in the financing mechanism. Next slide. There's two ways of looking at it. We look at it from challenges perspective. What kind of challenge is the financing trying to solve? And the challenges are in water challenges and the funding challenges. We have seen quite a bit on the research we have done at the scoping level when we were designing this. There's a still huge gap of legal frameworks in the transboundary institutions. While at the same time, majority of water, and especially in its natural form, surface water and aquifers actually is transboundary level. So there's been this gap between how water is managed versus the existence of water for a long time. And one of the biggest challenges we've seen is in the funding side is a lot of river basins tend to attract capital through the Ministry of Finance of the riparian countries. And that poses a plethora of challenges, from having different capabilities within different countries and therefore bringing different political voices on the table, to not agreeing in a one master plan altogether. So we have looked to design a mechanism that we will look at it. Next slide, please. That looks at financing directly from the Basin approach. So the idea is to put capital directly within the basin and not within independent countries. The mechanism, as I said earlier, it's a portfolio financing approach. It depends on countries having agreed on the master plan and the different investments that are in that plan, regardless of where they geographically are positioned. And I think this is a really important point, because the whole peaceful dividend comes from the idea that regardless of whether the fishing port is in country A and the agriculture is in country B, they are looked at it under one investment portfolio through the Basin organization. The financing structure we are designing, it's a blended finance approach. Public funding is coming early to de-risk and support planning and technical assistance in order to make it easier for the investment to come in. And we are planning different financial instruments, but we're going to start with a bond because majority of the investments and the demand is a long-term financing, and therefore the structure, but also to intermediate with the investors who will get an instrument that they understand, they can price and risk measure and be able to make a decision on it. We look at it from the financing perspective that this is an impact investing. So yes, there's a wider approach of investors out there, but also we want to crowd in investors who are traditionally not looking at these things to be able to tell them this is a way of building 21st century infrastructure and sharing of water. Next slide. So this is the mechanism diagrammatically. It moves from left to right. It starts with the River Basin Organization, develops a master plan. We, as Blue Peace partners, and I want to really thank our partners, there are many, but SDC and Geneva Water Hub have been critical in supporting us with OMVG and OMVS to design the mechanism. Once the master plan is developed, the master plan then derives the investment plan. And the investment plan has to be approved within the governmental mechanisms of RBO management. On the cases where we are looking at is a Council of Ministers. And hence, after the master plan is designed, there will be a need of creating an SPV to act as a development company, as a DevCo, in order to do these investments. A lot of river basins and lake basins have SPVs or different utility companies. And that's where the bond will be issued from. This structure of creating a mechanism of SPV, of issuing the bond, because we've realized a lot of RBOs have been a political agreement institution, and they're not incorporated as a corporate structure. And it's very hard to be a counterparty to an investor with an organization that you cannot sue, and it has all these immunities and stuff. So from the financing mechanism, we do both. This is where we're seeing as the underlying structure. One side is capital mobilization into the river basin, but the second side is the capacity building, and to be sure that the capacity of that organization is at the level that it can absorb the capital that is being mobilized, and the implementation. What I am probably not discussing here is the uses of funds. When they come in, it's a project finance mechanism. So they will fund projects, as I said, regardless of where they are geographically, as long as within the basin and they have been agreed with management and they have the cash flow to pay. Majority of the time, what we have seen is the RBO tends to be a wholesale to a utility company. So if you generate water through hydraulic then the buyer is the country's electric utilities. And that's where the cash flow will come in order of paying back investors. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, this is for us, the financing just doesn't come. It really has to have all these mechanisms in place, especially the political buy-in and agreement. There have to be an agreed pipeline of projects under a joint infrastructure and investment plans, which are anchored in a master plan. There has to be a technical partner who is actually has the engineering and capacity to deliver. Of course, on PPPs or implementation, river basins will be able to acquire this piece from the market on a normal procurement basis. The institutional mechanism and the right legal framework is paramount, like any other investment out there. But part of the technical assistance that Blue Peace support the river basin or lake organizations is to provide support to transform the legal mechanism, should there be a willingness to, in order to allow financing to come in. And of course, the framework for intervention needs to have a mandate of investment. Next, please. We see Blue Peace Index, which is managed by the economists as a way of measuring progress within the river basins. Next slide, please. And the fact that it's being measured, it's being implemented by an independent third party, it actually provides of improving the transboundary water cooperation and management of shared water. It looks at it, and investors have ability to look at it from the publisher's perspective, and they can be able to utilize it as an assessment of different policies, structure, and environments. Next slide, please. Currently, the assessment is in 5 basins, and you can find the index online if you Google. And we have put all this information we've discussed under one bluepeace.org website. I'd like to stop here in the interest of time. Thank you
very much. Thank you very much. Now this dovetails, of course, nicely into a concrete example of the application of these ideas. So I'll invite Mr. Ababakar.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot to the organizers and to everyone. I want to say hello to my friend Gafar. What he presented really helped and is helpful to my work. I would like to present you how we get on track with this initiative in order to move forward in terms of the financing in the basin that concerns us. I will briefly cover general aspects about this OMVG. Then I will cover what we could do with the funding mechanisms that we knew about and that we were using until now. And then I will cover the why and how we will try to follow this Blue Peace initiative, to get on track with the Blue Peace initiative, which really responds to our concerns. The OMVG is well known. It is the will of 4 countries, Gambia, Senegal, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau, which decided to harness all together the resources of the Gambia River and the other basins like the Kayamba, Kega, and the Koliba Korubal, 3 basins in total. This organization was developed several years ago and is based on a consolidated legal framework. They launched this joint organization, which is the secretariat, the organization, joint organization, which is the secretariat of the OMVG, in which all the works, all the investments belong to the states concerned. So there is a concerted management of the OMVG. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Of course, these investments require some funding. It is a challenge. They really need some funding that the states will be able to handle. It's not a problem at the OMVG. It is based on the state budgets, but the investments for dam works or high power interconnecting lines covering hundreds of kilometers, then we need the external funding. And the internal mechanisms are not sufficient, so we heavily rely on external funding. Very often, these projects covers very high amounts of money, hence the need to mobilize large funding volume. Hundreds of thousands of dollars, for instance. In the light of this, when we address the international community in this regard, yes, the country has some answers, but mobilizing funds, it takes a lot of time. The donors go through the states to handle the money that we need. And then states provide us the money, on-lend the money. But this means long deadlines to get funds mobilized, along with many constraints for such heavy budgets where several donors intervene. Several donors who have different requirements. Hence the need to cover all this before the mobilization of the funds received. Deadlines tend to be quite long because donors sometimes add other prerequisites that had not been considered at the beginning or in the inception of the process. Next slide, please. Next slide. What could we do with this framework? As indicated earlier, we have a legal framework, but the functioning is based on member states. We have a project covering 1,700 kilometers of lines and very heavy funding of more than 1 million euros involving 8 funding partners, including the African Development Bank, the World Bank, African Development Bank that might be around the table today, and other partners like that also include the participation of states, the state that on lend the funding while we execute the project. There is a case that should be highlighted. It is about a funding request that ended up to fund the OMVG. The donor was feeling at ease with the OMVG and could provide some direct funding to our body. Otherwise, most donors tend to go through the states. Let's move to the next slide, please. The next one. We have no, the one before this one, please. Go back, please. Yes, this one. This one is about the Sandangalu hydroelectric hydropower dam, which is quite huge, with a volume of 3.7 billion cubic meters. We needed to go fast with the funding, and we selected through a specific group a list of companies for which we developed some program for the funding of states like the state of Senegal. And there's been a private funding because we reached out to banks for the implementation, and we worked on the implementation of the guarantee because we realized that we could introduce the guarantee much faster, work on the guarantee much faster. However, there are still higher interest rates and the states must bring in guarantees. However, it is quite fast. It's a process that can be implemented and put in place quite quickly. And it is helpful to start the process. However, we realize that this kind of funding is only possible when it's about commercial services, when there are possibilities of profits afterwards. Next slide. Let's move on now to the Blue Peace opportunity. Why? Because we've covered the financing modes, but this takes time. Yes, there is some progress, but the needs are very consequent, and we need to mobilize the capitals, the funds that circulate and are sent to the member states directly or through the OMVG. We could see that this mechanism, this Blue Peace mechanism, allows to move faster and to solve much quickly our funding needs. There are also other challenges that oblige us to go and to move faster, particularly the problem of illegal migration that is increasing lately, as well as job creation and the attainment of the SDGs. Funding must also be efficient, And this requires urgent measures to solve these issues, these burning issues. We've had discussions with the Blue Peace promoters, including the Swiss Cooperation and other bodies. And we thought about developing an integrated master plan for which we got the agreement of the authorities. It has been accepted by the authorities, and it led to a strategic plan for the regional development that ensure the promotion of sustainable development. There will also be a tool to plan the development of the Basin under the OMVG jurisdiction. We will also adapt our OMVG legal and institutional framework to access innovative funding, because indeed our frameworks might need to be revised and help to access better the international funding. Next slide. Yes. About the Blue Peace financing mechanism for a body like the OMVG. Indeed, we need to harness the support of our partners and promote OMVG's access to international financial markets through the Blue Peace bond. The states have already endorsed the master plan. This is ongoing, and we are now in the final stage, and there is an organization that is working on this. We've also worked with the national consultants who are gathering or collecting all the information at the national level. This will take around 10 months in 2021. In the end, as the water is the engine in a way, we will be able to support other sectors and to promote the cross-cutting funding of the projects, the cross-subsidization of the projects. We work on the energy sector, irrigation, local development. So on different areas that will allow us to have a much more robust system and to access external funding sources. We are convinced that we should promote further blended funding along with the support that we will get from the traditional funding partners, and this will help us to find solutions concerning risk. Of course, we will need to consider how we can solve the problems related to the insurances in particular. Next slide, please. In fact, the PDDI, the master plan, the integrated master plan, will lead to a joint investment plan on the basis of which the bond, as we've just referred to the bond, on the basis of which the bond will be issued with the creation of an SPV vehicle within the OMVG. In the framework of the PDDI, we will consider whether the framework is adequate, and we will align it, and I think it shouldn't be any problem. We have a team that works on the institutional framework that accompanies the master plan. We also need to make sure that we have the possibility to reimburse the debt along with its interests. This is another objective that is present here. The purpose is really to make the OMVG autonomous in terms of financing mobilization. This is key. We need to be able, through its master plan for the integrated development that has been put on the table and accepted by all the partners, we need to be able to reach the autonomy and not to depend on the need to go through the states. Next slide. I think it's the last one. It's about the conclusions. Through this initiative, we really hope that we will enhance the peace dividend generated through the cooperation with the OMVG within the framework of this Blue Peace Initiative. The organization has been set up in 1978. It groups together 4 countries that have really exceptional good neighboring relations and that work well on the development. So it helps strengthening peace. And this is really key for development purposes. Blue Peace is the innovative financing model for the future OMVG master plan, and it can be combined with the traditional sources of funding that will remain, but that might be better adapted to what we really need. Of course, in this end, the OMVG should have a legal personality so as to be able to directly mobilize the financial resources. We will work on this in the framework of the PDDI, and we need to make sure that our proposals will be attractive on the international financial markets. Our purpose is to reduce the debt of our states. The system that I described earlier was based on the debt of the countries, and the countries had to bear with this debt. So this initiative should help us to really make sure that we reduce the debt of the different countries by promoting the access to new forms of capital. Last point, we will develop all these initiatives and the development of the master plan in an inclusive manner. It will be an inclusive process at national and international levels. It will involve different stakeholders. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me. This is the content of my presentation. Our organization is sub-regional, and we really want to fulfill our mission. We want to boost the financing from the different bodies that work on the financing of our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Babakar. That was excellent. Very, very interesting. Okay, now we have approximately 15-20 minutes for a Q&A. And as you have been instructed before, you can raise your hands or you can pose it in the chat function. In order to kind of launch straight into this, I'm going to pick a question from the someone who's raised their hand. Anuka Lipponen from UNIS. Please ask your question.
Can I be heard all right? Chair, it's actually more a comment or complementing information further on what Mr. Miralles presented. Because under the Water Convention, we've supported assessments of this water, food, energy ecosystems nexus, like natural resource management trade-offs in seven transboundary basins, linking intersectoral challenges to actually solutions, actions that could be taken across sectors in response. And Mr. Philippe Riddell has developed for us a report. This global stock taking of nexus solutions and investments is undertaken in cooperation with IUCN and James Dalton in particular. And this has the aim to show how these diverse kind of actions, not only infrastructure, but also instruments, governance action, to translate into transboundary benefits. And this also includes looking at how can such nexus solutions be financed. So there were several aspects looked at. What type of financing, grants, loans, bonds, equity, etc. What was the source of finance for these interventions? Was it state, development partners, indirect investors, users, direct investors, etc., or banks. And then also looked at financing pathways and transaction models involved. And what emerged from this, that most of these Nexus initiatives, they've been financed from funding specifically for that. State financing is very dominant in one form or the other. And beyond Europe, these have been essentially covered from development partners' grants. But since programmatic funding is an efficient way to mobilize public finance, and certain kinds of private financing, specifically bonds, could be issued for a series of infrastructural investments, this could circumvent these hazards that is perceived both from public and private side with respect to financing water sector infrastructure, which were raised here in this event also. So these cases that were analyzed through a questionnaire, they seem to support that there's a correlation between infrastructure measures and adaptable programmatic financing, and this would merit to be looked at further. That's what I just wanted to bring into this discussion.
Thank you very much.
Likely that multi-purpose investment is it goes in terms of revenue benefits and reduced risks much beyond what is possible from a single-use investment.
Right, we have a couple of questions now, actually relating to the Blue Peace process. I mean, what we're presented there is quite a complex arrangement involving governments and many stakeholders below that and whatever. So to cut, Mr. Riyad Awaja has this question actually, really relating. I mean, what kind of data is there now on the performance of these many agreements? I mean, these are complex structures. And I would like to add maybe just one aspect, it's what mechanisms are there really to resolve conflicts in these structures, especially within a bond structure? And I think that we're best to address this question to Mr. Machano. So Mr. Machano, do you want to give a stab at that?
Stefan, the stream is coming, so he should be able to, yeah.
Yeah, I think I can. Is my audio on? So yes, I think the political and legal structures that have underpinned the transboundary organizations, indeed, they are sort of the base of the analysis. And Blue Peace currently, from the partners' perspective as a UN agency and other donors, we do look at them at the beginning before deciding to support, because we support, as everybody understand, we function under the ODA, Overseas Development Agency funds, and those few. So we chose to start and pilot these mechanisms on the organizations like OMVG, where the legal agreements and the political conventions have already been settled a long time ago. And there is a subsidiarity element to it that the riparian countries have allowed OMVG and OMVS to be able to do this. And they've already done few projects. So actually, the mechanism is bringing efficiency to an already existing structures.
Okay, excellent. Maybe I'll just add another question. I mean, why do you choose the bond format, say, rather than a loan format?
So I think the best answer was already put in place by, was it Pete, in the closing session of the last session 3. We wanted to do 2 things, or maybe 3. First is, if you put a loan into a river basin organization, majority of the time the borrowers are riparian countries. So imagine you have 5 countries trying to borrow a common $1 billion, and they have to divide it based on their credit capacities. it becomes quite drag on negotiations, because all these syndications of bankers on one side have to talk to about 4 or 5 borrowers, or sometimes even more, and it can move quite a long time. So this idea of putting a bond into an RBO is basically you are summing all that up into one borrower. So it's an efficiency manner. That's one. Two is to issue an instrument that can go into a capital market and allow a wider pool of investors. Because majority of the time when a loan is issued by a development or other banks, it's actually within the balance sheet of that institution. So the idea is to widen up the pool, if possible, to as many as we can. And the third is to allow a mechanism of credit enhancement and guarantees that cushions, to a certain extent, the debt to the countries, and hence bring it a bit more instrument that investors understand. They can price it, they can look at the risk arrangement, and be able to trade in it.
It sounds like you're giving the traditional development partners a good run for their money.
That's not the aim.
All right, there's a question from Andreas Salinas, actually. I mean, and I think I'm going to, yeah, so effectively, these are all debt instruments, and innovative financing is often just another word, really, for one or other, say, increased debt. And we know that many countries are suffering from limitations there. And I was just wondering if anyone might want to offer to intervene on this. Is this an obstacle to these structures?
Stefan, was it a question?
It was a question
addressed to Klaffer?
direct.
Or just
he can answer if he wishes.
Okay, he just raised his hand, so the stream should come in.
So I agree with that, and I think it's quite a challenge, and it will be case by case. I don't think it's something that can be generalized. However, what we are trying to structure is to put a project finance through a portfolio of projects to be the payback cash flow to the investors. And then on top of that, add an insurance mechanism that covers the default risk. At the end of the day, you can argue if all goes bad from the insurance mechanism and the cash flow and all of that, it goes back to the countries. But I think for the mechanism we are trying to do, that will be maybe a third or a fourth credit event, and it will have to be a really catastrophic, which even that we are looking to do that through MIGA and others. So the idea is when a bond is issued, is first guaranteed by a credit enhancement structure, and secondly, by the cash flows of these infrastructure investments before it becomes an issue to the national debt. Therefore, we are hoping in the structuring process, and we will know by next year, and of course, we will publish this data, it will alleviate the national debt issue instead of adding to it.
And the IMF, I guess, is one of your interlocutors.
Yes, yes, and we have had.
How do they view a structure like this?
Of IMFs on this.
Yeah. All right. I'm just looking at the chat. We don't have any further questions.
Sorry, dear participants, I think there was a technical issue. I think Stefan should come back in a minute. Stefan, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear.
Yes,
So
you were cut for 10 seconds. So if you can just repeat your sentence, because I don't think we heard you.
I was about to say that we don't have any further questions, and so I was going to pose a few of my own, but Ababakar actually has raised his hand and he would like to, so please give.
I would like to add to what has been said regarding our experience. There have been financing, public financing, and we do know the limits. And we do believe that with the Blue Peace financing, there is at least what can be called an upstream implication in terms of the donors. Given with all the partners, when you have the master plan and when you review the institutional framework that we have, maybe we can anticipate some questions that the investors could have, knowing that the organization does stay in its initial way. It's an organization regrouping several countries, supported by strong legal basis. These are conventions that the countries signed together, and their commitment is absolute. It is clear that there will always be countries. What is important is to see whether there could be some adaptation on a legal basis that could help OMVS and OMVG to access to direct funding with certain guarantees to service the debt. And this could speed things up. We do believe that this is possible if we look at the sister organization that is OMVS, that has a certain number of works. The ASOGEM is entirely able to finance and to draw finance for certain project. And this is then replacing the countries, such as with the project RINA that has a cost. And that was done with Eximba China. Normally, 15% of the financing has been done by internal state, and it's SOGM that puts the money in place. So given all this, we know that this is possible to rethink the system so that the river basin organization can directly access to financing, so external financing, in organizing all the guarantees that we should have. This was just to strengthen what has been said previously. It is a challenge that we need to tackle to see how we can get through this and to speed up financing of our projects.
Thank you very much. Now we're reaching the end of the session. I would say maybe the title of the session might as well have been called Innovative Cooperation, because it seems from all the examples that we've seen, what precedes the financial, say, structures and the innovation is really a lot of investment in relationship building. And it's not surprising, really. Innovative financing is ultimately about risk sharing and sharing resources. And I think another interesting observation is that the time really that's required to reach that level of confidence and the investment in process that's required. I think the water funds are very interesting because what you see is a replication effect. I think the fact that we've seen several of these structures now take off and be successful is clearly, creating rings in the water, and people have greater confidence in looking at examples that have been done before. what's also clear is that really to establish these alignment of interests, you need to go a step further. And surprisingly, as always, we as water managers, we find that the catchment is actually one of the best frameworks for analysis of the different interests that we really need to understand. And when we talk water policy, we're in fact often impinging on energy policy and food. And yet the basin is a very much a robust object of analysis for that process. I think we also saw how insecurity itself creates inefficiencies, but that's also a huge opportunity, and finding those opportunities, again, requires bringing together lots of stakeholders, building on the structures that we see, as we've seen in the Gambia, for example. You're really capitalizing on the structures that we have. I think another key message here is that it's not really all on the project side or on the structure side. It's really finding the right investors who have the right mindset and interests. If you're transparent and you can tell a convincing story and you put in the right comforts, then as we saw, so-called impact investors or mission-driven investors are actually quite willing to take on innovation. So anyhow, that brings our session to an end. I understand there'll be a break now until 3 o'clock, where we'll reconvene. And I'd really like to thank all the speakers. It's been hugely interesting. And thank you for the
questions. Thanks a lot, Stefan, also to you for the moderation of the session. And indeed, there will be a 10 minutes break now. Sorry, it was supposed to be longer, but because of the exciting discussion, we had to go on a bit. So we will continue at 3 o'clock with session 5 to have like a online interactive discussion between representatives from an RBO, a country, and several multilateral development banks representatives. So I invite you to stay with us. And also, I would like to remind you that after this final session at 4:30, from 4:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. CET, there will be a high-level closing with Mr. Carlos Manuel Rodriguez, the CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility. There will be also Mrs. Jennifer Sarah, the Global Director of the World Bank Group Water Global Practice, and Mr. Henk Ovik, the Special Envoy for International Waters for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. So I invite you to also be there for the high-level closing, which will be really interesting. Thank you, and see you in 10 minutes. And for the foreseen speaker of session 5, I invite you to test your connection with us on Interprefy if you wish to. And to do so, you can raise your hand. Thanks a lot.